This is the Coronavirus Morning Report for Tuesday, April 7th, 2020. I'm Brian McCullough. The second day of good news numbers in a row is tempered by the fact that if this is the peak, that also means we'll be seeing some of the worst numbers this week as well. Remdesivir trials expand. Why you never want to be on a ventilator. They're only a Hail Mary last resort. The UK's antibody testing program is having problems, and several places are considering immunity certificates. For the second day in a row, everywhere I turned this morning, there were green shoots, reasons for cautious hope. For example, the most widely used model forecasting the coronavirus pandemic in the U.S. has revised downward its numbers regarding expected need for hospital beds and ventilators in the U.S. The model I'm talking about is the one created by the Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation, IHME, at the University of Washington. However, I want to note that as of right now, that model is something of an outlier, conflicting with other models that continue to show higher equipment shortages and expected deaths. This only underscores an ongoing debate about conflicting models. For example, in Washington, D.C., they are using their own numbers based on what they're seeing on the ground in their municipality to forecast what is in store, quoting the Washington Post. Local leaders in the district said on Friday that their model estimates the outbreak in the nation's capital will peak June 28th. The IHME model predicts the peak is coming in just days on April 16th. The district's model predicts hospitals will need 1,400 ventilators at the peak, while the IHME model predicts a need for only 107. The district is using the IHME model as a best-case scenario and the more dire model to prepare for a likely surge. D.C. Mayor Muriel Bowser said on April 2nd that data projections reveal the peak in possible COVID-19 infections will come in late June or early July. Quote, "While we hope that our experience will follow a curve closer to the IHME model, we cannot use a single model for our preparation and risk being underprepared. We continue to refine our models and assumptions and are tailoring them to the D.C. population and context," the mayor's spokeswoman Allison Reeves said in an email, end quote. Another example of green shoots. China announced no new deaths on Tuesday and just 32 new infections, all of them imported. The no new deaths number marks the first time that has been reported in a 24-hour period since China began reporting COVID-related death numbers all the way back in January. But of course, people have been widely skeptical of official Chinese numbers. New York's reported number of deaths was under 600 for the second day in a row, though Governor Andrew Cuomo remains concerned that hospitals are overwhelmed and materials are being stretched thin. The worry there is that if capacity is broken, deaths would no doubt increase, as patients would not all be able to receive needed treatment. I hope you'll understand why I caveated each of the hopeful numbers that I just read off, as I'm merely trying to be realistic. Even if we're reaching the peak of the outbreak in some areas this week, by definition, that means we will also be seeing the worst numbers ever in terms of deaths and hospitalization and new cases as well this week. Peak means peak. So while I do want to report the good numbers to you when I can, I also want to prepare you for the fact that we'll also likely have to report the worst numbers we've ever reported in coming days as well. Let's wait until we see numbers consistently dropping for a number of days before we begin celebrating. As an example of why I'm taking this cautious line, though there have been hopeful signs out of France in recent days, that country also reported its highest daily death toll yet yesterday, quoting the New York Times. France's health minister said on Tuesday that the country had not reached the peak of its epidemic and was still in a worsening phase. The country has recorded some 74,390 cases in total and 8,911 deaths, with the toll still steadily rising. Monday marked its highest 24-hour death toll yet, with 613 fatalities reported in hospitals. Olivier Véran, the health minister, told the broadcaster BFM TV on Tuesday that a slowdown in the number of additional patients in intensive care was encouraging, but added, quote, "We are not out of the woods yet," end quote. Interesting news out of New Zealand. Less than 2 weeks after that country enacted one of the strictest coronavirus lockdowns anywhere in the world, as the Washington Post puts it, New Zealand appears not only to be flattening the curve, but actually actively squashing it. Quoting the Washington Post, "It took only 10 days for signs that the approach here, elimination rather than the containment goal of the United States and other Western countries, is working. The number of new cases has fallen for 2 consecutive days despite a huge increase in testing, with 54 confirmed or probable cases reported Tuesday. That means the number of people who have recovered, 65, exceeds the number of daily infections. After peaking at 89 on April 2nd, the daily number of new cases ticked down in New Zealand to 67 on Monday and 54 on Tuesday. The vast majority of cases can be linked to international travel, making contact tracing relatively easy, and many are consolidated into identifiable clusters. Because there is little evidence of community transmission, New Zealand does not have huge numbers of people overwhelming hospitals. Only one person, an elderly woman with existing health problems, has died," end quote. Japan, meanwhile, has continued to opt for declaring states of emergency in specific regions of that country as opposed to a nationwide lockdown. And a crew member on board the USNS Comfort, the Navy ship docked here in New York City, has tested positive for coronavirus. After initially saying it will ban all exports of the anti-malarial drug hydroxychloroquine, the country of India now says it will allow limited supplies of the drug to reach countries hardest hit by the coronavirus pandemic. All 10 million residents in Los Angeles can now apply for coronavirus testing. This does not mean that all citizens will be able to receive testing, but LA is relaxing the rules that previously only allowed for testing of citizens older than 65 or those with underlying medical conditions. And at a single Detroit area hospital, more than 700 healthcare workers have now tested positive for COVID-19. The hospital in question is the Henry Ford Health System, quoting the Detroit Free Press. Dr. Adnan Mankara said 734 employees, 2.1% of the health system's workforce of 31,600, have tested positive for the novel coronavirus since tracking began on March 12. Quote, "We have tested nearly 2,500 team members across our organization, the majority of whom have tested negative," Mankara said in a statement, noting that some workers may have contracted the virus in the community, end quote. And quoting the New York Times, Prime Minister Boris Johnson of Britain remained in the intensive care unit of a London hospital on Tuesday morning, battling coronavirus symptoms, raising questions not just about the state of his health, but also about who would lead the country gripped by a major coronavirus outbreak in his stead if that became necessary. Mr. Johnson was transferred to an intensive care unit on Monday after his illness worsened. Aides said he had been moved in case he needed a ventilator to help his recovery. On Tuesday morning, Michael Gove, a senior minister, noted that Mr. Johnson was not on a ventilator but has received oxygen support. As Britain has no written constitution and no standard line of succession in the case of illness or death of the head of government, it was for Mr. Johnson to decide who should stand in for him if he became ill. But the man he nominated, Dominic Raab, has been relatively untested, serving as the country's foreign secretary for less than a year, end quote. According to Reuters, the British government has declined to say who currently has responsibility for the United Kingdom's nuclear codes, while Boris Johnson is treated in intensive care. And finally, Wuhan, the city in China where the outbreak first occurred, has announced that it is officially lifting its lockdown today. Clinical trials and emergency compassionate use of Remdesivir, a potentially game-changing antiviral developed by Gilead Sciences, are ramping up as the search for a treatment for COVID-19 continues. The drug is a broad-spectrum antiviral that has shown effectiveness in treating COVID-19's structurally similar forerunners, SARS and MERS, in animal testing. Though it remains in experimental medicine, Gilead has announced it is working with hospitals across the U.S. to offer so-called expanded access programs in which hospitals or physicians can apply for emergency use of Remdesivir for multiple severely ill patients at a time. The company has been ramping up production of the drug since January and says it now has 1.5 million doses on hand for use in trials, individual compassionate cases, and the expanded access programs, enough for more than 140,000 treatment courses. At the same time, in order to scientifically prove the effectiveness or otherwise of the drug, the National Institutes of Health here in the U.S. is expanding a huge clinical trial investigating Remdesivir versus a placebo beyond its original 440-person enrollment target. The trial, which is taking place in the US, Denmark, Germany, Japan, South Korea, Mexico, Singapore, and the UK, is one of a half dozen studies testing remdesivir around the world, and early results from some of these trials are expected in early April. In an open letter, Gilead Chairman and CEO Daniel O'Day said, quote, "Remdesivir is still an investigational medicine and has not been approved by regulatory authorities anywhere in the world. The safety and efficacy are not yet known, so while we feel the greatest sense of urgency in our work with remdesivir, we must take the responsible, ethical approach of determining whether it is indeed safe, effective treatment. This is why multiple clinical trials for remdesivir are underway, involving thousands of patients with COVID-19 across the world. We know from the heartbreaking letters we receive, the images we see in the news, and the all-too-bleak statistics, that the urgency to find broad, effective solutions becomes more intense each day. In the ways we believe it is appropriate for Gilead to play a role today, primarily through clinical trials as well as expanded access and compassionate use, we are doing everything it takes to meet our significant responsibility with remdesivir," end quote. Spending more time inside and alone than usual, it's easy to get stuck in anxious thought loops, like worst-case scenarios, what-ifs, ruminating about the past or projecting into the future. With social distancing, we need support now more than ever. Talkspace Online Therapy gives you the support you deserve on a schedule that works for you. Talkspace lets you match with a licensed therapist from the safety of your home. Get 24/7 messaging access to your therapist on any device and hear back daily. Talkspace therapists have experience treating a range of issues, including depression, anxiety, substance abuse, trauma, relationship issues, food and eating, and more. Security, safety, and privacy are top priorities at Talkspace. Their platform encrypts and securely stores all client information using the same technology used by the banking industry. We all need to talk through life's challenges. Talkspace offers the support we deserve at a price we can afford. Match with your perfect therapist and get $100 off your first month with promo code BRIEFING. Sign up at Talkspace.com or download the app. Don't forget to use promo code BRIEFING for $100 off your first month. Stamps.com brings all of the services of the U.S. Postal Service right to your computer in the safety and comfort of your own home, office, or anywhere else you're hunkering down right now. I've been telling you about how this allows you to stay inside and avoid crowds like we all should be doing right now, and I've told you how this will help small businesses continue to function even while working remotely. But did you know Stamps.com also saves you money with discounts you can't get at the post office? You get 5 cents off of every first-class stamp, for example, and up to 40% off USPS shipping rates with Stamps.com. And now, in addition to offering discounted U.S. Postal Service rates, Stamps.com also offers UPS services with discount rates up to 62%. Plus, with Stamps.com, you won't even have to pay UPS residential surcharges. Stamps.com is a no-brainer, especially now, saving you time and money and keeping you safe in these crazy times. Right now, listeners to this show get a special offer that includes a 4-week trial, plus free postage and a digital scale without any long-term commitment. Just go to Stamps.com, click on the microphone at the top of the homepage, and type in briefing. That's Stamps.com, enter briefing, BRIEFING. Stay safe, everyone. With how much we're hearing about ventilators these days, how many each hospital will require, what companies around the world are doing their best to manufacture more of them, you'd be forgiven for assuming that ventilators are some sort of panacea, a miracle for the coronavirus. Unfortunately, it turns out that is far from true in reality. From what we've seen so far, the outcomes for COVID-19 patients put on ventilators is not good. According to a recent case series published by the New England Journal of Medicine of COVID-19 patients in Seattle, of 20 who were put on a ventilator, only 4 recovered well enough to leave the hospital. 9 died, 4 recovered enough to be taken off ventilation but were still hospitalized, and 3 were still on ventilators at the conclusion of the study a few weeks later. The thing is, even if you don't die, you are not necessarily out of the woods and may suffer lasting consequences from having been put on a ventilator in the first place. Dr. Paul Mayo, a critical care doctor in New York City, told The Spectator, quote, "Putting a person on a ventilator creates a disease known as being on a ventilator," end quote. Another doctor explained, quote, "When we mechanically blow air into your damaged lungs faster and harder than humanly possible, ventilator-induced lung injury may result. Generally, for a person to tolerate the undertaking, we have to sedate them, leading to immobility and severe weakness. While sedated, the person cannot cough or clear their airway effectively, leading to superimposed bacterial pneumonia," end quote. And over the weekend, the New York Times published a piece by Dr. Catherine Draeger, describing in vivid detail what happens before, during, and after someone is put on a ventilator. The whole piece is worth a read, but here's an excerpt from Dr. Draeger on what patients may face after being taken off ventilation. Quote, "Even before COVID-19, for those lucky enough to leave the hospital alive after suffering acute respiratory distress syndrome, recovery can take months or years. The amount of sedation needed for COVID-19 patients can cause profound complications, damaging muscles and nerves, making it hard for those who survive to walk, move, or even think as well as they did before they became ill. Many spend most of their recovery time in a rehabilitation center, and older patients often never go home. They live out their days bedbound at higher risk of recurrent infections, bed sores, and trips back to the hospital," end quote. Adding to the risk is what another doctor describes as the unknown. Quote, "There has never been a placebo randomized control trial of putting people on ventilators versus letting them struggle on. We therefore do not, strictly speaking, know whether those who survive their time on ventilators may have survived anyway, or whether some would-be survivors died because they were committed to a ventilator. There will never even be such a trial. Sometimes we feel that a person will definitely die immediately if a mechanical ventilator is not applied, and therefore nothing can possibly be lost in the attempt. But mission creep affects us all. Every clear-eyed critical care doctor will admit that we sometimes ventilate people more out of wishful thinking, desperation, or fear of lawsuit than scientifically based hope for recovery," end quote. One crucial point Dr. Draeger makes in the New York Times is that people put on ventilators can't communicate and often don't know the consequences of what is about to happen to them. Some people, armed with knowledge and an ability to communicate their desires ahead of time, might not choose to go on a ventilator. How many machines might be saved, Dr. Draeger asks implicitly, if those who didn't want to be put on a ventilator weren't? It's a grim topic, but an important one to be aware of, especially as so much focus continues to be on the need for ventilators. Yes, hospitals need more of them, but don't mistake that as meaning a ventilator can cure. They are a last resort. Being on a ventilator, especially for COVID-19, is a sign that things are getting worse, not better. The bottom line is you never want to be put on a ventilator for whatever illness befalls you, COVID-19 or otherwise. We previously reported on the plans in the UK to order a huge number of antibody tests as part of the effort to reopen that country's economy by ascertaining how many people had already had coronavirus and recovered. Unfortunately, news has come out that not one of the 17.5 million tests that have been ordered so far has worked, quoting from the Financial Times. The UK government has admitted that none of the 17.5 million antibody tests that it ordered in the fight against the coronavirus pandemic work well enough to be used. Ministers had high hopes that the arrival of the test would give a much clearer picture about how many people had been infected by COVID-19, paving the way for an eventual easing of lockdown restrictions. The failure of the tests is a significant setback and suggests Britain may be farther away from being able to launch an effective program of mass testing. The government is working with 9 companies that have developed coronavirus antibody tests, which screen for whether someone has recovered from the disease and is likely to be immune. The tests are being assessed by researchers at Oxford University, but each one has so far proven unreliable. Quote, "Sadly, the tests we have looked at to date have not performed well," wrote Professor John Bell, Regis Professor of Medicine at Oxford University on Monday. Quote, "We see many false negatives, tests where no antibody is detected, despite the fact that we know it is there. And we also see false positives. None of the tests we have validated would meet the criteria for a good test as agreed with the Medicines and Healthcare Products Regulatory Agency. This is not a good result for test suppliers or for us," he said, end quote. As recently as this weekend, the UK government had issued advice saying that kits could be used to inform when social distancing measures could be relaxed. Quote, should our clinical testing prove successful, we hope to deploy antibody testing kits in their millions. In time and subject to clinical advice, they could even be used to inform the use of social distancing measures in the future. However, this is some way off, end quote. Professor John Newton of Public Health England told the Times of London, quote, the scientists in Oxford who have been evaluating them are working with manufacturers to say, we've tested your test and it doesn't seem to perform quite well enough, but we think we can work with you to improve it. So it is a little bit uncertain, but there are commercial partners able to work with us. I'm optimistic, end quote. Thank you to those of you who have been tipping us stories to cover in the podcast on the podcast subreddit, which can be found at r/coronaviruspod. There's a link at the bottom of the show notes. Talk to you all tomorrow. Be well.